Welcome to the Shepherd's Rest Doc Talk. This is episode 214. Thought we'd pick up in Luke again. We had stopped in Luke 11, and I wanted to move down to Luke 11, looking at verse 37. It says, "And as he spoke, a certain Pharisee asked him to dine with him, and he went in and sat to eat." Now, this whole event is him going in to sit. It's not just the Pharisees. They're scribes, Pharisees, Torah teachers, which some will say lawyers. Some Bibles will say that. Hypocrites. There are several people at this dinner. And again, they're looking at, why don't you wash your hands? Why aren't you doing these traditions? In which Messiah basically responds to, woe to you guys. Your inward parts need to be clean. They're full of wickedness and greed. But your outward parts, you look all holy. But he's basically saying, woe to you, because I see what's inside. Of the woes between verse 42 to 52, the most impressive one to me is in verse 44. And this is where it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you are like unseen tombs, and the men walking over them do not know." When one walked over an unseen tomb, they became unclean. They didn't even know it, but that's what happened. So here basically the Lord's saying, people who are coming to be taught by you don't even realize, but they are being contaminated because of the wickedness and the greed in your heart. They're being not just contaminated, but taught improperly. The Pharisees are showing themselves as the ones to be followed. And he says, you want the best seats, you like the notoriety, you want to have the best clothes, you want to do the things that make people look and admire you, but those actions that they're admiring actually aren't even what the Lord's asking for. They're not walking in what the Lord's asking for, so that's what people should follow, right? So a lot of talk, a lot of doing, but their talking and doing aren't lining up with the word. And I should say maybe sometimes that's some of their interpretation of it as well. And then he tells them basically, you're going to be killing the prophets. You are killing the prophets. You're taking what the prophets are saying and teaching, and you're perverting that, and you're twisting that. And in it, you also are continuously killing the prophets just like your forefathers did. And again, they will be doing that with Messiah when they try to figure out how to get rid of them, right? Okay, and we also have in here, it says the Torah, those who are learned in the Torah, that's in verse 46. And some of your Bibles will say lawyers. Again, those are the ones who are well-versed and help to teach the Torah. This isn't that he's not saying you're teaching the law, it's bad, you're putting a burden on them. It's all the extra man-made doctrine that they're putting on the people that's creating a problem. Just like this whole conversation started, he didn't wash his hands, and so they're like, oh, well, you don't even keep the traditions of men. That's correct. Messiah only kept traditions of men that lined up with the Bible, that supported the commandments. Okay, so I want to just bring those up because really this woe to you, Pharisees and scribes, it really goes into a few of the other chapters. We see that in chapter 13 and chapter 14. I want to jump over to Luke 13. When you go to Luke 13, verse 6, it says, "And he spoke a parable. A certain man had a fig tree planted in a vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. And he said to the gardener, 'Look, for 3 years I have come seeking fruit from this fig tree and found none. Cut it down. Why does it even make the ground useless?' And he answering to him said, 'Master, leave it here for a year or two until I dig around it and throw manure on it. And if indeed it bears fruit, good. But if it does not, then you shall cut it down.'" All right. The 3 years, I think that's interesting because Messiah has been teaching for around 3 years. So and that's the assumption that he has about a 3.5 year ministry. So we're going to go with that one right now. So I find that interesting because here he says, for 3 years I've come, the fig tree, Israel, I've come, and it's not producing the fruit. So we've got these leaders of Israel. Remember those Pharisees, Sadducees, the lawyers, all these people. And again, not all of them are bad. You've got a lot of Pharisees who are supporting him. We even see in the readings between Luke 11 and Luke 15 that there are Pharisees who are like, hey, you need to go. They're lining up with Messiah. But again, that upper part, that upper authority of the nation of Israel are not producing. And so that's Messiah's looking at the fig tree and going, they still aren't getting it. Cut them down. But wait, give them a year. Let's be able to plant. And within that year, if you think about Messiah is going to die, raise again, and then that explosion of understanding who he is going to go out. So hopefully by then, they will start to understand who he is. And more people do. So anyhow, that kind of goes back with the woes, right? Because again, woe, they're right there entertaining Messiah. They're entertaining Messiah. They're eating with him. They're visiting with him, but they're not getting it. They're not getting it here. They're just continuously mulling over and debating it. So if we move down a little bit more, we will see that this starts to show in Luke 13. The idea of the reign of heaven again, like we talked about in Matthew 13. You have it where it's like the mustard seed. You have the leaven in the bread. So again, we have this understanding of here's this kingdom and it's getting polluted. All right, so let's think about this. We've already had these these people in authority who are contaminating. Even happens in the kingdom of heaven. Right? We've talked about that. And so then you have in verse 23, and someone said to him, Master, are there few who are being saved? And he said to them, strive to enter through the narrow gate, because many, I say to you, shall seek to enter, but shall not be able. And then he goes on to say that once the master closes the door, there's going to be many who come and knock because they want into the kingdom, into the final, right? And they're knocking, they're wanting, he's like, go ahead, I don't even know who you are. And I thought about that this morning when I was making my bed. I thought, we read that where he says, I don't even know who you are. On this one, they're like, well, but we dined with you. You taught in our streets. You were always there with us. We know who you are. And he's like, I don't know who you are. It goes back to the Revelation to me where it's like hot or cold, lukewarm, I spew out of my mouth. I have no need for you. You're the salt that has no use anymore, and you're unsalty. You're too contaminated with other things. The salt at that time, it wasn't pure like what we have already processed salt. It was salt, sometimes can be within other minerals and other pieces. It can be good salt or not good salt because there's not enough of the salt in it for it to work, all right, for it to have the taste. And that's kind of going back to, there's not enough. You got the outside, but not the inside. You're not salty enough. You're useless. Here again, you saw me in your streets. You entertained me with your head, but not your heart. I don't know who you are. You need to go. So there's an understanding of the few versus the many, right? The few are not these who are going by what they want or being kind to themselves. That's the many. The few are those who are dying to themselves and saying, yes, Lord, let me reflect who you are. And as we continue on to Luke 14, we're back into this. He's eating again. He's going into a Pharisee, one of the rulers of the Pharisees' house to eat. And this is where he's, again, this whole thing about healing on the Sabbath. And that was earlier issue. And this time they're going to be quiet about it. Because you notice that the last time, and actually I didn't really say where it was, but it was in 13, and it's where he healed the woman who had the weakness in her, heals her, and they're complaining about, they being the Pharisees, and the leaders are complaining that you have 6 days to do this, and you don't do this on the Sabbath. All right, because again, they're not understanding the seventh day, the rest. That's the kingdom bringing in to heal, right? All those things are happening. They're not understanding that. So back here in 14, there's another miracle on a Sabbath. And he's basically like, is there a problem? Anybody have a problem if I heal this man? Which, not a word. No one said anything. He goes about, he heals it. And then he gives them a parable. He says in verse 14, verse 7 says, and he spoke a parable to those who were invited. Then he noted how they chose the best places, saying to them, when you're invited by someone or by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more distinguished than you be invited. And he who has invited you and him come to say to you, give this one place, and then you shall begin to be shamed and take the last place. So again, remember in the woes, don't take the best place. Don't want to be in the spotlight. All right, that's basically what he's going through. He's talking to these same people. He's saying, look, let yourself be humble so that you can be brought up. Don't put yourself in a position thinking you're all that, and then you got to be put back, right? So always be humble, basically. In verse 11, he says, for everyone who exalts himself shall be humbled, and everyone who's humbling himself shall be exalted. And then he goes on to give the example. He starts to talk about how basically don't give to people because you can get back. Just like Messiah, what he does for us, we can't not ever repay him for that. It's not even possible. It's not possible. So he's telling the Pharisees, look, instead of doing what's so great so you can get your name in spotlights or people will owe you, go help the people who can't give back to you. Go help the people who are in need, who never would have thought of being able to even participate in a banquet like this. And then he goes on as a response to verse 15, where it says, and when one of those who sat at the table with him heard this, he said to him, blessed is he who eats bread in the reign of God. And from there, Messiah goes back into this idea of the banquet. And this idea of the banquet is he goes and he invites the people, right? He invites his guest list, his people, he invites them. And the first guy's too busy, right? He's like, oh, well, making excuses. The first one is he just bought 5 oxen. The next one had just gotten married. The next one had bought a field. That I messed up the order there. But anyway, so everyone has an excuse. Oh, just not now. I can't right now. It doesn't fit in my timeline. It's not going to work. I'm busy. It's really not that great of a deal anyway. So then it says that the man of the house, basically the master of the house, then basically says, go out. He tells his servants to go out. He says in verse 21, hurry out into the streets and the lanes and the cities and bring here the poor and the crippled and the lame and the blind. Again, a perfect example of those who can't give back. Those who he's going to heal, because when he brings into his kingdom, he's going to heal them. He's not just going to provide for them in food and nourishment and enjoying it. He's going to heal them. He's bringing them in. And then the servants are like, well, there's still room. I mean, who was invited, who this was intended for, Israel and its leaders, those leaders who said no, it's like, okay, fine, let's bring in everyone. Let's bring them all in. Everyone who wants to come, and that's really what this is. Those who are willing to come in at that call, come in. It didn't matter what they look like. That's not dismissing Israel. There's many of Israel who came in, just not those leaders. Those leaders had an agenda. We have to be careful about that in Christianity. We have to be careful of that today in the religious world, that our agenda isn't, slapping God's agenda in the face. That we're not like, no, that can't be God because it just doesn't fit. And then what would I look like, right? We can't let those dynamics of the Pharisees still be there, because those woe to Pharisees, those woe to the leaders, that's still a woe to for us today as well. So he has them go out into, now looking for every nook and cranny of every lost soul who would benefit from this, who's willing to say yes, and brings them all in. That's what the kingdom's full of. The Pharisees constantly are complaining about Messiah eating with sinners and being with harlots, and right. Because, the Lord does not tell us to not be with those people. That's how they're going to see the light. We just aren't to take on who they are. We're to expose them to the salt, expose them to the light, not to take on their stuff. So anyway, the Lord is really talking about this with with the Pharisees. And in verse 27 it says, and whoever does not bear his stake and come after me is unable to be my taught one. Again, if you're not willing to die to your flesh, you're not willing to give up those things, you're not teachable. You're not willing to be transformed into the likeness of Messiah. And that's what we have to be in order to be his servant, a child of God, to be useful. We have to be able to be willing to give up our fleshly desires to be met by his spiritual ones. And then after all this, at the very end, he basically just sums it up with, he who has ears, let him hear. In other words, if you are able to hear my parable, if you are willing and you're really looking for it, you're going to understand what this means and you're going to seek after me. That's what we need to do. Read this, understand it, and then choose to seek after him. So on that note, let us have ears and let us have eyes. And let us pay attention to the words that the Lord spoke to the Pharisees, warning them. He constantly is warning the Pharisees to pay attention so that they do not find themselves on the wrong side. So they don't find themselves bearing the truth and killing Messiah. Of course, we have some that do, but we have a lot that come over and start to follow him because they see the truth, because they hear it. So anyway, let us have good ears and let us hear the word. Let us be found worthy because we heard the word of God and guarded it, watched over it. Have a splendid day. Have a great night, and shalom.